One of the things that I love is that two films idea of your life. And there's like two stories you can tell. One that is safe and full of regret, and one that is risky and full of pride and joy.
Awesome. So whenever I give presentations at like healthcare conferences and trade shows, typically I have a picture of my company logo on the front title desk, or maybe I have something about wearable healthcare technology. But we're at Team Do. This is about doing. This is about creating. This is about reaching for the stars. This is about going somewhere. And that act of going somewhere always involves a journey. So today's talk isn't going to be about Safe Wander. It's not really even going to be about the technology that I created. I want it to be about my journey. So here we go. My journey started with my grandfather. My grandfather really loved to sing. Growing up with him in a 3-generation household, he would always belt out battle hymns whenever we were chasing garbage trucks down the street every Friday morning. Or he would tuck me into bed at night with a soothing lullaby. Grandpa and I really were never closer than the times that we sang together. When I was 4 years old, my grandpa and I were on a family trip to Japan, and we were walking around a park singing one of our favorite tunes. And at one point, he suddenly became completely quiet, and his eyes sort of glazed over with this foggy daze. And even though I was only 4 years old at the time, I could tell from the look on his face that he was lost. Now, I was a 4-year-old person who was just lost in this foreign land. I was panicked out of my mind. So we walked around and around the park. He was carrying me on his shoulders, aimlessly, for what seemed like an eternity, until my mother finally found us an hour later. That 60 minutes was probably the scariest experience I've ever gone through in my entire life. It turned out that the moment that my grandfather stopped singing marked the first sign of his Alzheimer's disease. Later on, we learned out that his disease was progressing and progressing, and 2 years later, we were all sleeping in our home at night, and we were awoken by this sharp knock on the door at the break of dawn. We were shocked to see Grandpa standing next to a policeman, still in his pajamas. We later found out that Grandpa had been wandering aimlessly on the highway, and if it weren't for that police officer, who very luckily found him, something tragic definitely could have happened. So we knew that my grandpa's wandering could cause some serious safety concerns, so my aunt, my mother, and I all took turns looking after him day and night. And we also tried testing out a bunch of different technologies to help detect his wandering, but nothing really worked. Around the same time, an elderly family friend fell down in the bathroom and suffered these severe injuries. Became very concerned about my own grandparents and decided to create this smart bathroom system, which essentially consists of motion sensors that you install underneath the tile of a bathroom floor that would send an alert to a caregiver's wristwatch whenever somebody fell down in the bathroom. So I never was able to develop that into a fully fledged out prototype, but it sort of implanted in me this firm desire to be able to create technology to help the lives of the elderly. About a year later, we were on another trip to Egypt. This time I was about 7 years old. And I noticed that my grandpa was starting to forget to take his medicine. So when we got back to the States, I went to the local drugstore. I purchased this little medicine box, divided it into 7 compartments for each day of the week. And then I put an LED light and a buzzer inside each of those compartments to remind him to take the right medicine at the right time. Again, this wasn't developed into an actual device, but these were just ideas that I was thinking of in my head of how to be able to help my grandpa. So fast forward about 7 years, now I'm 14 years old, it's 2012, and my mom and I moved to New York City, which means that my aunt has become my grandpa's primary caregiver. So I became very concerned about her since she had to stay awake all night to keep an eye on my grandpa, and even then often failed to catch him leaving the bed. By this point, his wandering had progressed to the extent that he was stepping out of bed at least once per night, which put a huge burden on my aunt. And oftentimes my aunt would actually find my grandpa lying on the bathroom floor with blood coming out of his head because he had fell down as a result of his wandering. So I became very concerned about grandpa's safety as well as my aunt's well-being, and I knew that I had to take the problem into my own hands. But the question was, how? So one night, I came back. Oh, I forgot about something. My grandpa's and my family's challenges were actually only a snapshot of a much larger societal burden. There are over 47.5 million dementia patients around the world, and it's estimated that about 60% of those patients wander. On top of that, 1 out of every 3 seniors is at risk of falling. So I knew that this was a huge social challenge that I could hope to solve with my device. But again, how to do it? So one night I came back to California for Thanksgiving break to see my grandparents, and I was put on night watch for Grandpa. I saw him stepping out of the bed, and the moment his foot landed on the floor, I sort of had this eureka moment. I thought, why don't I put a pressure sensor underneath his heel, and that would detect an increase in pressure whenever he landed on the floor, and that would send an alert to my aunt's smartphone, waking her up. That way she could sleep at night without having to worry about my grandpa. Sounds simple, but no. There were 3 challenges that I faced. The first was creating a wearable sensor that could be placed comfortably underneath the heel of my grandpa's foot. It would also be able to detect subtle changes in pressure. Second, I also had to design this wireless circuit that would be able to communicate with my aunt's smartphone. And finally, I had to be able to code a smartphone app that would essentially alert my aunt whenever my grandpa stepped out of bed. So these were huge challenges, and it took over a year of effort, extensive researching, reaching out to experts in the field, leading online forums about coding, to be able to overcome each and every one of them. But by the end of those 3 challenges, I still realized that I had to integrate those components together into a working device. So I had this 4th challenge of integrating everything together. But I wasn't able to do it, which is why I had this blank space right here instead of an actual prototype. So what could I do to fill that blank space? Well, at first I thought that the answer was just more coding. So I created an entire new file of code in August of 2013, in the summer between my first and second year of high school. And I thought that this would definitely work, that I had finally found the solution that would make everything come together. But no. Instead, when I compiled the code, it had over 200 errors. And at that point, I just thought that this was an insurmountable challenge, that this project was destined for failure, and there was no way that I would be able to get it done. But then, with almost serendipitous timing, I heard my grandpa singing in another room. His once towering voice had been muted to this indistinct whisper, and he stumbled over many of the words that he once knew by heart. Instinctively, I placed my hands over his fragile palms, much like he had held my tiny hands with his meaty paws when I was much younger. We began singing together, and in a moment of sudden recognition, his grip tightened, and I knew that he still remembered me. It turned out that years of Alzheimer's might have eroded Grandpa's memory, but not the enduring love that we shared for each other. What I realized was that I hadn't really been missing code. What I was missing, what I had forgotten, what I had lost sight of was the original source of motivation for this project, my relationship with my grandfather. So I was galvanized to push forward and complete a prototype so that I could make my grandfather safe. And I was finally able to create 2 prototypes. The first was a sensor embedded inside of a sock. And the second is a reattachable sensor assembly that can essentially be put anywhere on the foot, shoe, sock, you name it. So I tested these on my grandfather for a period of over 12 months, and they were able to detect 100% of all the cases of his wandering. So I thought, wow, this is a really good solution to the problem. Maybe I could bring this to other people, since I knew that there were millions of other dementia patients who suffered from wandering. So I brought the device to several care facilities in Southern California in the summer between my second and third year of high school. And I asked them if they were willing to test out my technology. To my surprise, there were a lot of people who were actually willing to beta test this technology that was made by only a 15-year-old. So I was like, wow, okay, this is awesome. So we put the sensor on a number of different dementia patients. And what we realized was that even though the sensor worked very well on lots of dementia patients who wanted to wear socks to sleep, the sensor didn't work so well on people who didn't typically wear socks to sleep. So you would be like, hey, Marcia, if Marcia were a patient, could you put these socks on? They're meant to help your safety. And then Marcia would be like, okay, sure, yeah, of course. And then you'd come back 30 minutes later and you'd be like, Marcia, where did the sensor go? And she's like, oh, I took it off. So what we had realized was that that was a problem. A lot of dementia patients forget why they're wearing these devices in the first place. So if they see a sock, they're going to forget that it's a sensor that's meant to help their safety, so they'll just take it off eventually. So I realized that there was a need to create a non-sock solution that would be able to help lots of other types of patients. So this was another huge challenge. By this point, I had already come up with a different idea. Instead of maybe using pressure to detect whether or not somebody was off the bed, maybe use changes in body position. So as a person gets out of the bed, the body angle changes. Maybe we could use that instead in order to determine whether or not somebody was wandering. But the question still lingered, how do you attach that sensor onto the patient's body? So at first I thought, okay, maybe Velcro would work, maybe some magnets, but neither of those were really strong enough to be able to stay onto the patient's clothing whenever he or she tried to take it off. But sometimes the answers to questions can come in the most unexpected places. And in this case, it happened to come in the form of a jar of jam. So one morning, I was just making breakfast for myself as usual, and I was putting some jam on my bread. And as I was unscrewing the cap, I sort of had another epiphany. I thought maybe we could attach the sensor onto the clothes just like you would screw a cap onto a bottle. So I'll show you what I mean. So this is the sensor right here. It comes with both the sensor component itself, on my right, on this hand, and a cap on this hand. So let's say that this were the patient's clothing. So you have the sensor right here on the front. And the carrier goes to the back and screws it on with the cap, like so. So that way, if patients try to take it off, they can't do it. You have to go and unscrew it from the back. So we realized that this was a very, very secure method of attachment. So we tested this on a number of different patients at lots of different beta care facilities last summer. And none of the patients who were wearing the sensor were actually able to take it off. So we said goodbye to the sock sensor and hello to the button sensor, the second idea. I also created this gateway which essentially acted as a range extender. The sock sensor only worked in a very short range, so if you ever stepped outside of the patient's room or even outside of the patient's home, you wouldn't be able to receive alerts on your smartphone. So this gateway essentially relays the Bluetooth signal from the sensor to the caregiver's smartphone via the internet, and that way the caregiver can receive alerts no matter where they are, even if they're in a different country, as long as they're connected to the internet. So I combined these two pieces together, the sensor and the gateway, put them into a little package, and started selling them last December on safehorner.com. So my work has received a lot of recognition. I'm able to speak to you guys today. I was also invited to lots of other cool speaking gigs. But ironically, my grandpa is the only one who doesn't really recognize what I created for him in the first place. But with every single melodic alert that the smartphone triggers, it creates this sort of same fulfillment and the same joy that my grandpa's singing once did for me. I realize now that grandpa is safe in the hands of my sensor, just as I was sheltered in his tender, loving arms years ago. So I've gotten to the end here. I realize that a lot of other sort of speakers here are talking about, I guess the wisdom, the bits of wisdom that they accrued over their career. And I'm only 17 years old, so I really don't have that much to share with you. But I was thinking to myself about something that I could say to you, something potentially inspiring. What I realize is that a lot of the speakers who come to these types of events are always like, work hard, follow your dreams, and all of those things are true. But I'm going to tell you something a bit different today. I'm going to tell you something that might be a bit controversial. What I want you guys to take away from this is just one lesson. Accept things the way that they are. Now, I know that that might be unconventional for you guys because you're always hearing from other speakers about how you have to break boundaries and challenge the status quo. Nothing is ever perfect. Keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And then one day, you'll get to the perfect sensor or system or technology that you're trying to create. But a while back, I had this sort of epiphany. I was in my bedroom. It was early in the morning. I looked to the left wall, I looked to the right wall, and something very interesting happened. So I looked to the left wall. I imagined that everything in the past that had ever occurred was behind that left wall. All the leaves that had ever fallen down from a branch to the earthy ground. All the earthworms that have ever crawled the face of the earth. All of you, all the infants that were ever born, somewhere behind that left wall. Then I imagined that everything that is ever going to occur in the future is in front of that right wall. So all of the distant possibilities of what might happen, all of the things that we look forward to, all of our expectations were there in front of that right wall. And I imagined that my room was just the present. It was that thin sliver in the vast continuum of time that existed between those left and those right walls. And suddenly in that moment, I felt incredibly rooted in the present. And what I'd realized was that your entire life, you're sort of swimming along this current. And there are two walls in front of you and behind you. There's the future and there's the past. And you're always trying to get to one of those two walls. You're trying to get to the future so that you can fulfill some sort of expectation, get to a deadline, or you're trying to swim back to the past. You're trying to reconcile something that you did wrong in the past. You're trying to correct an error. But those two walls are moving at the same speed of the current, and you can never catch up to them. All that is ever experienced, all that you've ever done in your life, all that you've ever felt, happened in the now. You might think that something in the future might happen. You might be looking forward to a deadline. But even that act of looking forward is happening inside of the present. All that ever exists is what's happening inside the now. So instead of trying to fight the current, instead of trying to get to one wall or get to another wall, just surrender yourself to the current and let everything happen. So Of course, it's important to have dreams. Of course, it's important to aspire to something in the future. Of course, you need to have goals and ambitions. But those dreams, sometimes they let you down. Things are impermanent. Nothing ever really lasts. So instead of trying to strive towards something that you might not be able to achieve, instead of trying to get yourself angry and upset about something like a particular failure when you're working on a project, instead of that, all you have to do is just surrender to the present. And what you have to realize is that even though you can't necessarily achieve those dreams, the disappointment behind that underlies all of those failures necessarily is this mind-created emotion about something that occurs in the future that you don't even know will happen. So you don't even know what's causing the disappointment in the first place. If you simply surrender yourself and accept the beauty of everything that's occurring in the present, then all your problems will be solved. So people always talk about how they're trying to find some sort of beauty in the future, how they want to make sure that their prototype is going to work with 100% efficacy. But you have to realize that you are living in one of the only inhabitable planets in a galaxy that's filled with billions and billions of stars. You yourself are a seemingly random amalgamation of molecules and atoms and chemicals, of nucleotide bases, billions of them that are somehow interlocked into this perfect pattern that forms you. You are you. You are a miracle. And we are all miracles who happen to be here today, who happen to be learning from each other at this conference. You are occupying one of the greatest slivers of time in this vast thing that we call history. You are living in the 21st century, the era of the most progress that has ever occurred in the world. You are incredibly lucky to be who you are, to be where you are. And that can only be realized when you accept that the present is a beautiful, beautiful gift. It's not in the future that you're going to find some sort of joy. It's not in the past that you're going to be able to reconcile something that happened. All that was ever felt, all the beauty in life, all the joy, all the contentment is right here now. Thank you.